So now we're going to lay out the piece. We're not actually going to write it yet. We're not going to write individual sentences yet, but we're going to organize the structure of the piece. And the structure of any kind of opinion piece, of course, is all about argumentation. It's all about laying out the arguments for your particular opinion. Laying out the arguments has typically two different goals. There's a logical goal, so you give the arguments, and from this, logically speaking, like the computer could see that from these arguments, your conclusion follows. But laying out the arguments also has another kind of goal, namely a rhetorical goal. It's one of convincing the reader, not by doing any tricks which are not right, but by applying certain kinds of techniques which simply work better. So your main goal, because again I emphasize you are an academic, your main goal should be logical. You should be convinced that indeed your conclusion does follow from your arguments. But when you're writing a piece, you also have to always be rhetorical. Rhetorical sometimes has a bad name, but it is a technique which you have to use, because if you're not interesting, if your piece is not interesting, if it's organized in the wrong way, you're going to lose your readers, and they're just not going to be convinced for that reason. So your arguments have to be right, but they also have to be presented in the right way. Now the classical way of doing that, and this is really literally the classical way of doing it, because we have inherited it from the ancient Greeks and in particular from the Romans, is the following. You start with your thesis. You start with your opinion. You start with the kind of thing you have to say. There's many different ways of organizing an opinion piece. They don't always necessarily start in this way. They're not always structured in this classical way, but the classical way, well, at least we can say it's well tested, right? So it has a few thousand years of testing behind it, and it works, and it's also relatively easy to apply. So I would advise you, as a beginner in this trade, I would advise you to use this technique, to start with your thesis, to immediately say what you have to say. What is the thing you want to present here, your thesis? And then you present the potential counter-arguments against this. That is to say, you present them in as far as you know or think that your audience is aware of those counter-arguments. I mean, if you're presenting something completely new about a completely new topic which nobody has ever thought about, maybe you don't want to go too much into all kinds of counter-arguments you invented yourself, because, of course, the function of discussing these counter-arguments is to show why they're not true, why they don't hold. And after that, you present your arguments, the arguments in favor of your thesis. Why this order? But that is, again, a purely rhetorical issue. Logically speaking, it doesn't matter in which order you present your arguments. There's no reason to think that. But rhetorically speaking, there is. Because, so the idea is, the classical idea is, if you first present the counter-arguments and then the arguments, basically people have forgotten most of the counter-arguments once you get to the arguments, and the arguments work much more forcefully. So you should, it's just a way of organizing the things which you already have to say anyway, so there's nothing wrong about that, there's nothing false about that, there's no trick about that. But this, if you have to present them in some order anyway, why not present them in the order which is most effective? And then finally, after that, you get to your conclusion. And also about this, there's something rhetorical to say. So opinion pieces, or actually any kind of article which people read, articles for a general audience, have a nice structure if that structure is circular, as we say. So if in the end you come back to the beginning. So you presented your thesis in the beginning, so your conclusion typically will refer to that as well. You've started saying, well, we should forbid all red cars. And then you give all the potential counter-arguments of fans of red cars. And then you give your own arguments of why red cars are completely to be avoided in the public sphere. And then you come back in your conclusion and you say, well, all of these arguments show that I am right and we should avoid red cars. Going back to the beginning is a very simple trick, but it really works. And then each of those two parts, the counter-argument part and the argument part, themselves have to be organized in some way, and we organize them in what is called the argument sandwich. The argument sandwich means we have strong arguments, let's say that you take your two strongest arguments and you put them right at the beginning and right at the end, and your weaker arguments you put in the middle. So the bread of your argument sandwich are your stronger arguments, and your weaker arguments are in between. Again, this is a purely rhetorical device. Again, of course, it doesn't matter, logically speaking, in which order you present your arguments. So for the ideal reader without any feelings, without any of the human shortcomings, you could present them in any kind of order. But since humans are not perfect, it's better to present your arguments in such a way that they get them in the best order. And the idea is, if you start with a weak argument, then people will immediately lose their interest. They think, okay, if this is what you have to say in favor of forbidding red cars, I'm not going to care. If you end with a weak argument, people are going to leave the argument section with a feeling of not being completely satisfied. Again, feeling, well, okay, so this is it, really? This is what you have to say? So you have to start with some like smash in the face. This is so that people, basically they have to acknowledge, yeah, okay, this should be true. Then you give some of your weaker arguments. Hopefully you have an embarras du choix. You have too many things to choose. There is too many different kinds of arguments to choose. But there will be some which are still weaker, and you end with your strong argument, leaving the reader with complete conviction of what you have to say. This is going to be your homework assignment for this week. This week you only have to find one opinion piece, a new opinion piece. It's probably going to be a bit longer. It should be, again, at least 500-600 words. Probably you will need to find something which is a bit longer so that all the different kinds of arguments are there. Because it is important that this paper you find has the relevant structure. Okay, so that might make it a bit more difficult to find one where you can obviously see the structure and analyze that. Because that's the assignment, write 200-300 words about the argument structure. So analyze the argument structure. Which are the counter-arguments? Which are the arguments? What is the thesis? And what is the structure in which, the order in which the different arguments are given? Is it right? And how does that work? And then I see you next week.